Okay. As we begin this session today, which will ultimately focus on leadership, I just want to give a little context of how we got to where we are right now. Dr. Harris brought up the potential of this grant, and as we discussed it about how we could formulate this, it was born out of many different things. For most of us who serve in the church, we are like other churches of the mainline denominations. Our baptisms are down, the overall memberships are down, and if we're not careful, the church wrestles with its own relevancy to the world today. And many of us, as we do church, we are framed by a particular matrix of success. And that matrix of success often has to do with size of congregation, how much money you have, how big is your building. Well, what we want to try to do is step past that and help us create a different matrix of success. That if we can meet this in our ministries, absent the big buildings, absent the large crowds, that we can still feel that there's some level of success that we have in doing ministry. So this idea of revisiting the call, because for the church, if we're not careful, it's always been something owned by the church and claimed by the church for use only in the church. But we contend that God calls doctors, lawyers, and Indian chiefs. And anyone operating out of a call from God has to have some contribution to the kingdom of God. What if the church could help folk find what God has for them to do in their life that would create fulfillment of what the purpose of what that life should be? That's what we're trying to get at here. So as we begin today's discussion around leadership, we're going to hopefully, as we go through this process together, we'll all open up to greater ideas and different ideas of how we do what it is that we do. So when we talk about call, we don't often talk about God calling us through various times in our life to different things, to multiple calls, to what those calls mean not only for us and our families, how to discern those calls. Sometimes it is our communities that are calling us, and that call can be just as strong as that ambiguous call that we want to attribute to the divine. All those are things that we hopefully through this next 5 years that we create a body of work that would be a treasure to the church to be able to delve into the work that we do as we try to revisit this notion of call. So today, even as we look at the idea of leadership, within our church, we talk about servant leadership quite a bit. But I would contend that if we really look at it, we spend more time on the leadership end than we do the servant end. Jesus himself said that the Gentiles will rule over you, but it's not to be so among you. So we want to talk about leadership in a way that would hopefully expand our minds and push us past some of the contexts that may even be those constructs that really keep us from developing this new matrix of success. Dr. Harris, who allowed myself, and I saw William Green in there earlier, that we put this thing together, and I can recall at a Cracker Barrel on the side of the interstate, Dr. Harris and I were making corrections for 5 or 6 hours in those rocking chairs outside. And what was good about that exchange was nothing was off limits. Nothing was already predetermined. Nothing was set that would stop us from at least considering something that for some may not be considerable. So all we ask you to do is open your mind up. We're going to need your contribution to the process because it won't work. We need all these minds. But today, as we start with leadership, we're going to give way to Dr. Phyllis Hildreth, who's going to come, and she's going to make the introduction of the two presenters. But it is my hope and it is my prayer that you would engage yourself in this, because we need your involvement. We need your input. As we move forward, we're going to ask that you write some things, that you submit some things, that you become part of this process. I am personally excited about it, because for me, my idea of what I was given as what church is hasn't produced the fruit that I thought it should. It wasn't until I dumped that box out on my own and stumbled through picking and choosing what to put back in the box, what to leave out of the box, and trusting that God was a part of that process. So I'm encouraged, I'm excited, and I know you're going to hear from William Green at another point, that you would take part in this and help us move this discussion forward, because I honestly believe that just as God calls preachers, that it is just important for all of creation that he calls all of us just the same, and that call to service in the church is no louder than that call to service in the world that same God created. I'd like to introduce to you our project manager, Dr. Phyllis Hildreth.
Thank you, Reverend Tucker. Thank you, members assembled here about to embark on this great journey with us. My task to introduce you to the two speakers is really to introduce you to the three persons who are going to be active with us during this journey. I feel very much like the one who was called to pick up somebody else's vision and make it plain and run with it. So from whatever transpired on that cocktail napkin and those rockers in front of the Cracker Barrel was a grant application that I received. And what does it mean to have this journey? And so with the team that embraced me just for the last 2 months, we sat and we constructed a process. And I would submit to you that each time you join us in the afternoon after lunch, there will be 2 speakers, but the third person, just like Scripture, is the process, right? So how will all of us work together? So a little bit about the process before I get to our flesh and blood presenters. We here are beginning to model a learning hub, an innovation hub, and we call it the Hub on the Hill, to market and distinguish it from others and make it very much that is from, belongs from, and eliminates the information that we receive here at American Baptist College. And on this hub, we will, after this session, invite congregations to apply for 12 slots to be a part of the inaugural cohort that will continue to go on this journey with us together. And if you are one of those congregations, you will come meet with us about quarterly, and we will come see you, and we will delve more deeply into what does it mean for call and leadership. What does it mean to design and redesign our ministries? What does it mean to prepare for new, invigorated, Christ-centered engagement in the world, right? So to do all of that, it's like, well, we need a template. And then I thought, oh, maybe I know why I'm here. Not because I used to be a juvenile court public defender, but that may come in handy, particularly when we get into engagement. But the thing that maybe I'm called most to do is to teach. And not really to teach, but it's to share learning with others. I get excited about learning. What are we going to do together? So we really sat down and created a curriculum, if you will, a class pattern. And that's what, if that is a process, I would like for you to start thinking about this now, carry it through this week, and carry it through the rest of the journey that I hope you'll stay with us for. And that is 3 things. How can we sit with 3 questions? What will we learn together? What will we design together? And then what will we do together? Or in other words, how will our designed ministry do justice, love mercy, and work humbly in beloved community together? Right? Kind of see how that's kind of lining up, what that's doing? So, in doing that, you are going to hear every time we offer a presentation, not from one sage on the stage, but at least two persons, because we want to model, practice what we are extending, is that this work is we work. This work can never be done alone in isolation. Very much taken by the scripture where Jesus sends out the 70 two by two, right? And everybody comes back excited about what they were able to accomplish, but they accomplished it together. So come hear the pairs of presenters that will be before you. And then also invite and pray on what the Spirit illuminates through the process to determine what we will learn together, what we will design together, and what we will do together for the Lord. So with that, in my first job, which was to be a lawyer, in that training, we had a term, res ipsa loquitur. The thing speaks for itself. I feel that way very much about the presentations and the introductions. I will not be long. These gentlemen speak for themselves. The first is my current employer and institutional leader, President Forrest Harris, President of American Baptist College. And he will be joined by, if that's my institutional leader, my current spiritual leader is my pastor, the Reverend Dr. Herbert Lester, pastor of Clark Memorial United Methodist Church. And part of the design was how better to take leadership and active leadership that knows about the rest of the journey and can get us started. So now, hear these gentlemen as they lead you through the beginning of the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Phyllis. We are so excited to have you share your leadership in this grant initiative over the next 5 years. Thank you, Pastor Lester, for joining us today to start this conversation. I have some handouts that you may take now. I don't know whether they're on the table but if they are, called and Caller, a Theology of Vocation, Call to Lives of Meaning and Purpose Initiative, CLM, the Lilly Endowment Initiative, American Baptist College Innovation Hub, our Garnett-Nabrit Lectures. That's the title. It's on front and back. So that we can take advantage of the full time together, Pastor Lester and I are going to talk about calling, and being called as it relates to leadership. We're going to be talking about leadership and the other parts component of this calling, caller, over the next 5 years so that the leader or leadership of churches can have a creative capacity to engage what and how God and communities call each other to God's purpose in the world. So what does it mean to be called to lead lives of meaning and purpose? This is the question. What does it mean to be called to lead lives of meaning and purpose? And that calling to lead lives of meaning and purpose is over the span of life, not one definite, final moment, not something fixed and non-fluid, but what does it mean to be called or have callings over a lifetime that will help us lead lives of meaning and purpose in the world as we seek to respond to God, the communities, and the relationships that shape who we are. Our traditional understandings of call has been fixed in a tradition of leadership that is not open to more callings or creative nuances of what a call or callings mean. Our callings have been somewhat understood as a distant God with a fixed providence and purpose for your life. A distant God with a fixed purpose and providence over one's life, rather than a God who is in relationship with one's life and the lives of people around them, so that we may develop listening practices to continue to hear God's call. There's nothing more tragic for leadership than to stop hearing God's callings. I've been called to preach is the kind of way in which we anchor a sense of call. But over a lifetime, that call must hear God's calling over and over again. So to be fixed and absolute in one specific moment in one's life about a call and not understand that that calling must be open to how God will continue to speak as God calls purpose and meaning into your life. So that's where we want to start. In the handout, I say, what does it mean to be called to lead lives of meaning and purpose? Calling over a span of life. What does it mean to talk about God's callings in relationship to the duration of our lives? Those pastors that may be in the room, for the Brooks and others, over 30 years plus, and those who may have been in 10 years, or those who are just getting started. But particularly as you have conversations with each other as we break up, I think Brother Brooks and others will tell the younger pastors that they've had to have listening practices to hear God's call over and over again, that the call is never concrete and fixed. And when it does become concrete and fixed, it becomes provincial and limiting and not open, not broadening the capacity for us to understand God in new contexts and in relationships that were not as obvious or not as active when we experience a moment of call. So that is an important question. Then if we have, as church leaders and congregations, if we are involved in conversation in a cohort to reflect upon a life as calling in these areas that we call leadership thinking, or ways to think to connect a life of callings to justice and to flourishing and to openness as to how God might involve us, then we must, in terms of leadership, re-examine what it means to be called to lifelong listening practices. And that is the task of what we hope over the next 5 years that we will develop is listening. Let me give a story, and so I can anchor what I'm going to say in my own journey. I started out as a facility compliance officer with the federal government to do government-owned contractor-operated compliance reviews under Executive Order 11246. I still remember the executive order. As a sense of my career as a college graduate, first Knoxville College, to have a responsible life and participation in community, raising a family and living the conveniences of whatever my income and job would provide. That was it. That was it. Until purpose and meaning began to grab at a deeper level than that achievement. And not knowing that the relationships that had shaped me as a boy growing up in Spring Hill in Memphis, Tennessee, the church, my mother, my father, who was a deacon, my mother, who was just in the church all the time, all of them, the preacher, I love the Lord, he heard my cry and pitied every groan. Long as I live while trouble rise, I'll hasten unto his throne. I didn't know that was marking me, marking my sense of who I was in relationship with my mother, my father, and my brothers and sisters. Until after graduating from college, going into the professional world, it began to rise up and grab hold of my thinking and my sense of who I was in a way that my professional life did not anchor me. And I opened myself up by becoming a deacon of the church, or being chosen to become a deacon of the church and a Sunday school teacher. And I thought that was satisfied, and it did not. I tried to teach Sunday school, but I didn't know at the time that was a calling, could have been, or being a servant leader in the church as deacon was a calling. And I didn't even know that in my professional work as a compliance officer, to make sure that people receiving grants from the federal government were not discriminating against people of color and women was also a calling. I didn't know how to connect meaning and purpose to my life as a beginning professional as a calling. And during that period, I was the head compliance officer for a review of Timex Corporation in Little Rock, Arkansas, who were making time increments and so forth for NICE at the time. And they had an affected class, women doing the same job as men but receiving less pay. And when we walked in the plant and found that affected class, the commercial that was popular at the time, when we found it, and they had their corporate lawyers there, and I'm the only one there as the compliance review from the government, but I had the whole government on my side. I knew that, EEOC and the like. I said, you have an affected class. You can get your lawyers involved. I can get the Department of Labor lawyers involved. But that commercial says you pay now or pay later. Pay me now, pay me later. You remember that? And they decided to pay now because I knew it was an affected class. My point is, they corrected that affected class and awarded about a $1.3 million affected class remedy for those women, most of who were black. I didn't understand that as a call. But justice was done for those women who were experiencing discrimination based on sex. If I had understood that as call and be able to apply the good news of God to that call, I could still be in that arena, but I had a traditional understanding of what? Call, that excluded me being called within the structures and systems of injustice in our society. And therefore opened myself up for further experiences of that call, and I felt it was being called to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ, which meant for me to resign that government job, which I did, and come to American Baptist College. I already had an undergraduate degree now, Knoxville College, but I heard preaching and others demonstrate something that I thought was most powerful. Still having this understanding of call, and I came here to be retooled and to be educated in the theological, biblical understandings of God's life in the world. Well, the rest is history. Now, sometimes, Brother Lee, I think I got it right, but sometimes I think I got it wrong. I don't know a preacher that is worth his or her salt that always has clarity and certainty that you got it right. And if you do have that certainty, you're of a different cloth, that the cloth that weaved my sense of God's relationship with me. Because as it ends up, the call that now I share and feel God is calling is not in the church, so to speak, as a pastor preacher, but a call in education, theological education, that has me before you today, living it out. So that's my own experience of having an understanding of call. So within the ecclesial life of expressions of Christian faith, we have traditionally thought of call as a fixed purpose for a distant God, examining callings rather than over a lifetime. If God is not fixed, can you say God is not fixed? Then calling can't be fixed. If God is always open to enter into the spaces of human life in ways that challenge you to rethink one's life, meaning, and purpose, then we must always be open and fluid to God's callings. So, first consideration, number one, is on your handout. Call is relational between, read it with me, the caller, calling, and called. The caller. If God is the caller, how does God call? And if the calling is from the one who calls, how does the called understand that process? I think you have to understand and grasp and understanding of all three. I have so many students. I've been called to preach, but they don't have understanding of the caller or the calling. And then they proceed to try to live out a call without a understanding of the relationality of all three. So that's one. Number one, call is relational between the caller, calling, and call. And by relational, I mean God's calling happens in what? Relationships. Relationship with people, relationships within the context where people have relationships, and one's relationship with God. And God is involved in that relationality. Brooks is a family of preachers going back to his dad, so forth and so on, and a history. That context and that relationship has something to do about his relational understanding of his own life. It ended up that it impacted him in a way that he discerned that his life was be in that arena. But for me, my son, he ain't got nothing, he don't want nothing to do with it. He's vice president of Lululemon in Vancouver, Canada. And he was in church every Sunday. I drilled it in, you know what? But that was not how God dealt with him. But sometimes we have a context and a tradition of imposing what it means for us. And how much have we robbed the church of creativity because we've imposed an ecclesial understanding of call and not know how to celebrate a mother who feels called just to be a mother, to raise children healthy. How much have we robbed the church of creativity and yield great potential for people simply because we don't understand business persons as being called of God to do business in a way that blesses the kingdom of God, to be enterprising around the resources that God makes available in the world and organize those resources in a way for the flourishing of the community. And sometimes business persons in the church, if you don't have a place for them to be trustees, they have no place. Because we are limiting the relationality and quality of how God enters into the diverse spaces of our relationships. Second Corinthians. So the calling is integral to human personhood or to human personality. God, in our relationships, in the network of our identities, works in and through those relationships and identity to speak to us in ways that bring meaning and purpose into our lives. Wife's husband, God's calling. It's a whole difference to understand one's family and marriage as a calling. But most of the time we exclude a sense of God's calling in that relationship. And how much do we end up not yielding much fruit and much enrichment because our families are not seen as a calling. And we abuse our families, exploit our families, neglect our families. I'll speak for myself. I don't have to speak for you. I miss my calling within the understanding of my family and impoverish them because I thought calling was fixed. A distant God with a providential plan that I had to discover rather than seeing that it was in relationship within the very family God had blessed me with. So thirdly, if calling is discerned through relationship, what does that do in terms of our sense of leadership or the spaces in which we share leadership? And most of the time we see leadership as an expression of leadership in the church as pastors. And leadership then becomes prescribed based on the ecclesial history and traditions that have shaped us. It becomes hierarchical. The God's going to give the pastor the vision for the church. Hierarchical. God is going, the church calls me to lead the church so that I can listen to God. God shares the vision with me, and then I come and share it with the people. If there's some transparency in the room, how many of you have either suffered under that vision or still think that is what's working in the life of the church? I'll raise mine. Even as it relates to leadership of American Baptist College. As president, God's going to give the president the vision for the college. And the president shares the vision of the college with the academic dean. And the academic dean shares the president's vision with the faculty. And the students become the recipient of a hierarchy that does not service the creativity God has called them to. So rather than the reason why we got this grant or we participated or we was sent the RFP is because I've been sharing at the level of Lilly engagement and peer groups that a sense of vision for black institutions. We've always suffered under hierarchies of oppression and privilege that robbed our institutions of their capacity building. So we mimic models of white institutions. We mimic models of dominant paradigms of academia rather than in relationship with each other. Our churches become fragmented and isolated. Phyllis, will you help me when I'm up on 30 minutes? I think I've been going pretty good. We isolate our churches even in that vision. So the churches don't know how to be participatory in community with each other because everybody has a calling. We'll do most of the work in terms of saying that people have gifts, and we use that passage in Paul to help people, but we only want them to exercise the gift within the hierarchy of our vision. So when some communal challenge to the life of the community is upon the life of a church for relevance, we have no way of collaborating because calling is fixed, hierarchical, and the leadership is usually male. 2 minutes. So I'm going to let Pastor Lester come, but I wanted to get to this model, and he's going to do about the same time I've done, and then we might have some time to kind of bridge these together. But you remember Samuel, the boy, who did not yet know God was in his life. And he heard, but he couldn't discern what he heard, so he needed intergenerational wisdom to help him hear what he was hearing. We've cut off intergenerational wisdom. We're not talking to each other. Brooks ought to be talking to young pastors, young people, period. Pastors are not. Laity, intergenerational wisdom to help us hear what we think we're hearing. And the intergenerational wisdom said is in relationship, right? Israel is in relationship with God. Israel is in relationship with its ancestors. And Israel is in relationship with the future God wants for it. But Samuel, the boy, is hearing about that in the context of Israel at the time. But he couldn't discern it. So a process is needed for leadership to develop listening practices to help us hear. And if we hear appropriately, and I love this statement, we become, on the back, we become who we are as unique persons through what? Who comes into a person's life may be the single greatest factor of influence to what that life becomes. Ed Sanders and I, Ed Sanders in my life and I may be in his in a way that we never had an idea that entering into each other's lives and space will lead to our efforts, a calling to prevent our people from dying from HIV and AIDS. Is that right, Ed? I never dreamed it. But who comes into your life, comes into a person's life, that person may be the singular, or those relationships may be the singular greatest factor that influence what that life becomes. The boy Samuel went to Eli, says, "What am I hearing?" And this innovation hub, this cohort, this leadership has to be vulnerable and open enough to ask lay people, what am I hearing? Rather than the lay people coming to you, asking you what you're hearing. It ought to be a reciprocity because God's call is not fixed. And if God's call is not fixed and fluid, that calling, the relationship between the call, the calling, and the caller ought to be open to listening practices. And we'll see if some of those listening practices for leadership may have some impact on how we understand how we might involve ourselves in a new sense of call.
Good afternoon. It's indeed my pleasure to be here with you, to President Harris, Professor Hildress, Reverend Turner Tucker, brothers and sisters in Jesus Christ. I can't begin to tell you how excited I am about the possibility of participating in this tremendous initiative here at American Baptist College. And with your permission, I'll just kind of pick up where Dr. Harris left off in terms of calling and my own experience and perceptions about calling. And with also your permission, I'd like to contextualize what I hope to share in two ways. First, from the book of Acts. if you will remember the first chapter of Acts, the disciples, Jesus is about to ascend to heaven, and the disciples are asking him, Lord, are you going to put us in charge right now? Are you going to give us the kingdom right now? He said, no, y'all need to wait. You need to wait until you have power. And when you have power, then you should be my witnesses, not only here in Jerusalem, but in Samaria and to the uttermost parts of the earth. And then there's this passage from Annie Dillard, which to me says, if I believe this passage from Scripture, what I believe about power, then I ought to also be aware of this reality. And it's on your sheet. It says, why do people in church seem like cheerful, brainless tourists on a package tour of the absolute? Does anyone have the foggiest idea what sort of power we blithely invoke? Or, as I suspect, does no one believe a word of it? The churches are children playing on the floor with their chemistry sets, mixing up a batch of TNT to kill a Sunday morning. It is madness to wear ladies' straw hats and velvet hats to church. We should all be wearing crash helmets. Ushers should issue life preservers and signal flares. They should lash us to our pews. For the sleeping God may wake someday and take offense, or the waking God may draw us to where we can never return. And so I believe that this power that God gives is real, and that one of the expressions of that power is how God calls people to be involved in God's purposes in the world. Now, I have not always had this understanding. As a matter of fact, I began wrestling with the call to ministry when I was about 8 years old. And I didn't tell anybody, because in my neighborhood, if you wanted any peace in your life, you didn't tell anybody that you wanted to be a preacher. Not at that age anyway. But my understanding was extremely limited, and it was a vocational understanding of what call was. And it took me some years. I've been a Methodist preacher now for 42 years. And it took me many, many years to grow beyond this limited and limiting vocational understanding of ministry to realize that I had actually been invited to participate in a way of life. That Jesus came along and invited people to a way of life in the midst of the power of the Roman Empire. Jesus invited people to this way of life and called people. God calls people to become part of that way of life. And since doing some additional readings, especially the work of Kathleen Callahan and Bonnie McLemore, the whole notion of calling as a lifelong participation in the purposes of God has really gotten me excited, and that's why I'm glad to be here today. Because I think knowledge and learning are powerful and give us power. But I also realize that calling happens in context. It does not happen separate and apart from where we are and what's going on around us. As Dr. Harris says, it also happens as we are in relationship with the people around us, and that while it most certainly has a vocational element, whatever our vocation might be, it's not purely vocational and hierarchical, as Dr. Harris was saying. Now, one of the most helpful things for me was Howard Thurman's book, Jesus and the Disinherited. Because in that book, I found a call to lives lived, as Thurman puts it, free from fear, hypocrisy, and dishonesty, and hatred. Thurman says the masses of men will live with their backs constantly against the wall. They are the poor, the disinherited, the dispossessed. What does our religion say to them? The issue is not what it counsels them to do for others whose need may be greater, but what religion offers to meet their own needs. The search for an answer to this question is perhaps the most important religious quest of modern life. What does it mean to be called to be a member of the community of faith? What did it mean in the first century to be called to be a person free of fear, hypocrisy, and hatred in the middle of the Roman Empire? What does it mean to be called today in the middle of the American Empire to live a life free from fear, hypocrisy, and hatred? Like Dr. Harris, I too have children who grew up in the church. I have 5 daughters. One of them is a regular attender at church and participant in the church. And to give you an idea of how they feel about church, when my next to the youngest daughter, Lonnie, who's now an attorney, was in the 11th grade, I got a car so that she could drive, she and her sister, to school, and her mother and I would not have to hustle across town to pick them up every day. The rules for having the car were very simple. Lonnie, you can't let anybody else drive the car. Lonnie, you have to keep the car clean and keep the oil changed, and you got to go to church on Sunday. Lonnie says, well, Dad, I'm not into organized religion, so I don't think I can go to church on Sunday. So, Lonnie, I completely understand, but organized religion bought this car. So my expectation is that you will be at church on Sunday. Well, she said, Dad, I cannot with integrity accept the car. Here are the keys. She gave me the keys back. I sold the car. But that was her attitude. Now, we're still just like this. But in terms of organized religion, the hierarchical understanding I think I had did not speak to her need. And so she's still a very spiritual person, still searching, but not finding what she needs in the church. And so I'm hoping, because I think I'm enjoying the best years of my life right now. It took me this long to learn what to do with life, and I'm about to step out of it. But I'm hoping that I will learn, and that through me and those with whom I do ministry, they will experience God's call in such a way as to respond to all of the desires and needs of those who no longer see their spiritual needs being met in the church, or those who are just in the church just to be there. Now, I also think that in this call that Thurman says Jesus gave, that freed people from fear, so that they realized the only thing they had to fear was God. And since they didn't fear anything, they didn't have to lie about anything. They could be honest, and that they could also free themselves of hatred, because hate destroys the hater and does more damage to the hater than it does to the person who's hated. And so in this call to this kind of freedom, people were validated as unique creations and expressions of the Creator. They found that human personality is what's of ultimate worth. They found inspiration and motivation and determination, information and installation from all of the stuff that was happening in their world, and they became actualized people for the first times in their lives. They realized the possibility of reaching their full potential. And so they were free from what Walter Wink calls the domination system. And domination systems are those systems that are politically oppressive, economically exploitive, and religiously sanctioned. Right. Jesus lived in a domination system. Yeah. The Sadducees that sold out, they were in the temple, but they compromised with the Roman government. We too live in a domination system. We too compromise with those who exploit us, with those who oppress us. As a matter of fact, now I've only lived in Nashville a couple of times and then for a few years. I'm from Memphis like Dr. Harris, so y'all might not do it in Nashville like they do it in Memphis. But around every election, candidates start showing up at churches, and money starts changing hands as candidates come in and use our gathered communities to push their campaigns. Just as one, now I don't know if they do that in Nashville or not. I know they don't do it at Clark in Nashville, but I don't know. But we sometimes become accomplices in our own oppression and exploitation. And part of our being called is understanding all of this connectedness, this contextualization, all of these relationships. And one of the things Jesus, I think, taught his disciples, found in the 5th through the 7th chapter of Matthew, called the Beatitudes, was how to live out this freedom from fear, hypocrisy, and hatred that being called into this community actually gave. For example, just to use a couple of the Beatitudes, Jesus said to, if somebody strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other cheek. Well, the idea is that in Jesus' world, the ultimate insult was to slap somebody on the right cheek with the back of the left hand. Jesus says, if somebody insults you like that, turn the other cheek and then watch them try to figure out how to slap you on the other cheek with the back of that same left hand. In other words, by being willing to take something on yourself, you flip the script, and then who's in charge? Or there was a law that said if a Roman soldier commanded you to carry his pack for 1 mile, you carry it 2 miles. Then who's in charge of the situation? Jesus said if they take you to court, and in an attempt to take everything you've got, starting with your coat, and they take your coat, give them your shirt as well. In other words, you can leave the courthouse naked, but everybody in town will know who did it to you. Everybody in town will understand that you were taken advantage of. And so, as I understand, being called, not just vocationally, but into this community of people, into these relationships, being called over the entire course of my life, depending on what God's purposes are at any particular point in time, I'm able to live free from fear, hypocrisy, and hatred, to reach my fullest potential and to help make the world a better place because I'm a part of God's purposes. And I hope that's helpful. And as we share and dialogue, then I'll be happy to respond to any questions. And let me again thank you for the privilege of being in this hub on the hill today. Thank you.